Hi everyone! As some of you may know, a few weeks ago I flew out to Egypt to attend COP27, which is the United Nations Climate Summit. I originally intended to film daily update videos to summarize what I learned, but two things happened. The first, I got sick on the first day, so I actually missed a whole day of the conference, which kind of put me behind. And secondly, when I went to the actual conference on the second day, I was extremely overwhelmed. I didn't really understand what was going on in terms of negotiations because the UN uses a lot of high-level jargon and terminology that I just didn't quite understand. And also the conference was massive and I spent a lot of the time just trying to find my way around the conference. Came home back to the Airbnb and was just extremely exhausted to the point where I knew that if I had filmed an update video, I probably wouldn't be giving out accurate or the best information that I could, and I like to do things to a high quality, and so because of that I decided to wait, come home, process my thoughts, and film this video, which is going to be a kind of high level what I learned at COP27 and what was my experience like going to the conference. This video is going to be split up into 4 parts. The first is going to be what exactly were the main outcomes of COP27. I'm going to be attaching a link to an article that goes more into detail about the high-level outcomes if anyone's interested. But the point of me making this video to talk about the outcomes when you could just read an article is really just to break things down into layman terms, because what I found and what was really frustrating for me was that reading these articles and just talking to people who were much more knowledgeable than me, I found it really hard to actually understand what was going on in terms of the negotiation side of things. And so I did end up doing my own research and really grappling and understanding the content. So I'm going to try to explain what happened at COP in simpler terms, so that people watching this, like my peers at McMaster, anyone else who may not be working in the climate space, can actually understand what is happening. As part of that, like a subsection of high-level outcomes of COP27, I will be talking about specifically initiatives that were announced regarding the built environment, and that's because I know a lot of the people watching this, if you're coming from LinkedIn, a lot of my LinkedIn network is professionals working in the green building industry and the built environment space. So I thought that if I just recap a couple things, hopefully that will be of use to you. The third section of the video is going to be talking about just some random facts that I learned at the side events I attended, and also just talking to people at the conference. And then finally, I'm going to talk about just my overall thoughts about the conference. My hope for this video is really that I would be able to share my experience at the COP, because it really was a privilege for me to be able to attend the conference. It's very hard to obtain a badge and you need a financial means of getting there. I wanted to share that experience with people who might be interested but didn't get a chance to attend this year. But more importantly, I'm hoping that through knowing more about the conference and the UN processes and just climate change in general, hopefully this video will empower some of you into action into your own communities, because I think that's really the goal, and was really the goal of me going to this conference. So with all that being said, let's jump right into the video. I'm going to be looking down on my laptop a little bit, so just bear with me because I have a lot of notes and I can't remember all this information. The first thing is things regarding loss and damage. Loss and damage, this was the first year that it actually was an official agenda item, and countries have been working for decades trying to get some progress on it. So it was really nice to see a bit of progress on it this year at COP. Just to give a little bit of history into loss and damage, first of all, what is it? It is referring to developed countries, so rich nations, compensating developing nations for the loss and damage. And when we say loss and damage, we refer to things like infrastructure loss or just loss of livelihoods because of the effects of climate change. So we're really talking money here, the flow of money from developed nations to developing nations in a fair and equitable way, because it's a justice issue. Past efforts on loss and damage include the Warsaw International Mechanism. This, at a simpler level, is just a high-level body that was established to address and enhance action for loss and damage. Underneath the Warsaw International Mechanism was the Santiago Network, and this was established underneath the WIM. to connect developing countries with providers of technical assistance. This was just a means of giving countries knowledge. So having said that, there was an agreement at COP27 to create a real-world advisory board for the Santiago network. This is good because in the past they just established the network, but not much work had been done on it yet, but now they agreed to create this advisory board on it. The main news, I would say, of COP27 was that there was an agreement on a fund for loss and damage, which is extremely good, and obviously it's a first step. There's a lot more work that needs to be done because we need to figure out how we're actually going to fill the fund up with money. Austria, New Zealand, and Belgium did pledge money to the fund, about $300 million, but unfortunately this is still not enough, and it's very little compared to what countries actually need in order to actually deal with the effects of loss and damage. So yes, ultimately good news, but we still have a lot of work to do in terms of how this fund is going to operate. The second outcome is regarding this 1.5 degrees Celsius. For those who don't know, at the Paris Agreement in 2015, the countries pledged to reduce and control global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees, preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the significance of that number. Last year in Glasgow at COP26, the mantra was kind of keep 1.5 alive. And this year, what I found, just through attending negotiations and also just reading articles, is that most scientists actually think that 1.5 is out of reach at the current rate that we're going, which is very, very unfortunate news to hear. But what I did hear at the negotiations, world leaders were saying that we can't just erase the target. We can't say, oh, because 1.5 is out of reach, let's just go to 2. For 2 reasons. One, because if we don't have our target at 1.5, things will just get worse. And also because at this rate, every 0.1 of a degree Celsius really matters. So everyone is in consensus that we really, really need to keep the target on 1.5, even though it might not be possible. The text, which is essentially the main outcome of COP27, was this Sharm El-Sheikh implementation plan text that they were working on. When I say text, just like a piece of paper, like a document. This text, unfortunately, does not ask countries to make stronger pledges on their nationally determined contributions. They recall the request made last year in terms of pledges. It also, the text unfortunately does not call for emissions to peak as soon as possible, and especially it didn't call for emissions to peak by 2025, which is what the IPCC says is necessary in order to keep global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So long story short, the text that was made this year barely maintains the language of 1.5 that was made last year at Glasgow. So not much progress has been made on that, and not much more pledges were made, unfortunately. So that would be kind of a bad outcome of the COP, I would say. Number 3, we have fossil fuels, talk on fossil fuels. The bad news is that in the text, there was no mention about phase out of fossil fuels. There is language on phasing out unabated coal, which refers to coal that is not mitigated by technologies like carbon capture and storage, which is essentially sucking out carbon from the atmosphere. However, the text does not contain any language on phasing out all fossil fuels. I'm referring to coal, natural gas, and oil. This is really unfortunate, and I actually did hear countries like Russia and Saudi Arabia, I heard them live saying this in the negotiations, things like, we need to stop focusing on the energy sources but focus on the emissions, which, if you think about it, is quite a ridiculous statement because, well, the emissions come from the energy sources. So of course we need to focus on the energy sources and fossil fuels specifically. So comments like that were made by some countries like Russia and Saudi Arabia, which I think is largely preventing more strict wording on the text regarding fossil fuels. The good news, I guess, kind of, is the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. This is what I mean by UN jargon. That sounds extremely intense, and what the heck does that mean? It's essentially this treaty that prevents the expansion of the use of coal, oil, and natural gas by ending all exploration and production of those fossil fuels. It just aims to phase out fossil fuel production in line with the 1.5-degree global climate target. 2 countries have signed. I guess you could call that good news, but also not really, because there's still the other 193 countries that have not signed this treaty. But I think this treaty is gaining some sort of momentum, so hopefully we will see more in the upcoming months. Just an action item here. If you're an individual who wants to sign this treaty, you can go and endorse it. I will put the link in the description below. Another sort of agenda item is the methane pledge. Countries who sign the pledge commit to reducing methane, which is another greenhouse gas. They commit to reducing methane levels by at least 30% from 2020 levels by 2030. And what this amounts to, it could amount to eliminating 0.2 degrees Celsius of warming by 2050. So the good news is that the number of countries that have signed this pledge increased from 100 to 150. The final main thing is regarding finance. One of the main talks of the COP, or anticipation, was how we're going to fulfill this $100 billion that countries pledged to. The Canadian climate minister said that the $100 billion was basically pulled out of a hat. There wasn't really any quantitative analysis done to obtain that number. So actually at COP27 this year, a new target was evaluated based on fully assessing developing countries' needs. The final text, didn't contain any concrete number. One report said that about $2.4 trillion needs to be funded, which really emphasizes kind of this need to go from billions to trillions, because just that much money is needed for adaptation and mitigation. The text, however, does say and address the necessity of the transformation of the financial system and its structures and processes. So they're really calling on multilateral banks and other financial institutions to restructure their lending to prioritize mitigation and adaptation efforts. Okay, I feel like I talked a lot there and don't know if I explained things properly, but if you are interested, please go read the article. I'll put the link to that article in the description. It does a really in-depth job at explaining what happened at COP. The first thing is the buildings breakthrough. So basically at COP26, what is called the Breakthrough Agenda was launched, which aimed to strengthen international collaboration on the decarbonization of high-emitting sectors. So this year at COP27, a buildings-specific breakthrough was reconfirmed, which essentially is trying to make near zero, almost net zero emission buildings the new normal by 2030, and we are seeing that in a lot of countries building codes already. Canada did support this, which is really good. Another campaign that was launched is called Roof Over Our Heads. This campaign seeks to address the lack of safe and decent housing in the most climate vulnerable populations in the world. Their goal is to improve the living situation of over 2 billion people living in informal settlements by 2050. There was another kind of key document called the Summary for Urban Policymakers that was launched at the conference. It has actionable policy guidelines for city and urban policymakers to really build resilience of urban environments. A couple other statistics which may not be great to hear, but even though there has been an increase in investment and an increase in buildings that were mentioned in countries' nationally determined contributions, the buildings and construction sector was found in a report to not be on track to achieve decarbonization by 2050. However, the good news is that the percentage of construction companies by revenue that joined the race to zero have doubled since COP26. And also, the total number of asset managers committing to net zero through the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative has increased to 291, which represents 66 trillion assets under management. I just touched on a few high-level things there. If you want to take a closer look, again, I'll put the link to the Built Environment initiatives in the description below. The second part of the video is just a couple of random things that I learned that I thought would be interesting to share with you guys. These are things learned at the side events and from talking to people. The first one, this person from the European Cyclist Foundation, she was talking about how they recommend that countries spend 10% of their transport budget on cycling, because cycling is actually one of the fastest and most efficient solutions we have to decarbonize the transport sector. Speaking of cycling, we have a survey going on for Zero Waste McMaster. If you're following, if you go to McMaster, we are thinking of bringing back a referendum to include Sobe bikes in our student fees for around $20. Details haven't been confirmed yet because we still have to talk to the company, but we just want to get initial student support on it. So if you are interested in something like this, please go on Zero Waste McMaster's Instagram and fill out the survey. It'll take like 2 minutes of your time. A couple other facts. Carbon capture and storage is not as good as we think and can often be seen as greenwashing. This is because the energy that is required to power the carbon capture and storage actually means that the carbon capture and storage ends up putting more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere rather than removing it. So it's not as good as we think, and this point was brought up in the context of a lot of fossil fuel companies and countries at COP27 advertising and trying to tell people that, oh, look, we have these efforts to use carbon capture and storage, but in reality it's not actually a good solution, and really we just need to phase out fossil fuels, including things like natural gas. On the topic of this, another random thing that I learned is that natural gas is actually really comparable to coal when it comes to just how bad it is for the environment. Traditionally, I think the thinking has been that natural gas should be a transition fuel because from an emissions factor standpoint, it is cleaner. However, recent research has found that it's actually very comparable to coal if you consider the methane that is involved. Basically, natural gas developments leak a lot of methane, which is a greenhouse gas that is 28 times more potent than carbon dioxide in terms of global warming potential when measured in a 100-year period. I mentioned this a little bit at the beginning, but I was very, very overwhelmed at the conference just because I quite honestly felt really, really dumb. I don't learn about the United Nations and their processes, and I don't learn about this high-level government action on climate change in my program. I'm in civil engineering. I learn about structures, and unfortunately this isn't covered in my degree, and so all of the learning that I do on it is self-taught. Initially, the first day that I was at the conference, which was day 2 of week 2, I was just having a hard time finding my way around the conference because there was just so much. Each country had their own pavilion, and there were side event rooms but also negotiation rooms. The conference grounds were just huge and there were 40,000 people there. It was really overwhelming. I eventually kind of found my way around the conference and went to a few country pavilions, but a couple of things about the conference that I just like to note. There was actually a lot of talk about greenwashing, and I did notice it a little bit myself at the conference. There were 636 fossil fuel lobbyists registered for COP27, which was an increase of 25% from COP26. And just to quantify that number for you a little bit, if fossil fuel lobbyists formed a country delegation, it would be the second largest at the summit, behind the UAE. Which is kind of crazy to think about, that there were that many fossil fuel lobbyists at COP27. Another fact, 18 out of 20 of the corporate sponsors of COP27 directly support or partner with the fossil fuel industry. And as I mentioned earlier, Canada, along with other major fossil fuel producers such as Egypt and the UAE, used their stands to advertise plans to use carbon capture and storage, which, as we know from our random facts part of the video, is not actually as good as we think it is. Myself, personally, around the city of Sharm El-Sheikh, I did notice a couple of signs talking about natural gas and how it's really green, which obviously we know it's not because it's a fossil fuel, and as I mentioned in the random facts part of the video, is just as comparable to coal. So yeah, there was a bit of greenwashing at COP. Now, I don't want to focus on the bad parts because I do think a conference like this has tremendous potential to create positive change. And what was really cool and inspiring was seeing 40,000 people at the conference, all here for a common purpose. I'm sure maybe some fossil fuel lobbyists were there who had ulterior motives, but for the most part, everyone at this conference was incredibly passionate about creating a brighter future and working towards helping the people right now who are most impacted by climate change. And for me, as a university student who hasn't entered the workforce yet, I think that's really inspiring to see, and I really want to join in that fight. I talked to a couple of organizations who are doing really amazing work on the front lines of climate change, working to make buildings more resilient and actually retrofitting buildings, but not in the traditional sense that we think of in Canada of increasing energy efficiency. They're retrofitting buildings to help developing nations fight against things like flooding. which is really cool and not something that we think about in Canada because we're really fortunate for the most part to not experience flooding and other climate disasters here. But that work is very much needed, and it's, I think, a really cool intersection between civil engineering, what I'm studying, and climate change. Looking to explore that space a little bit more in detail.
Hi everyone, I'm here with Sarah from Build Change. Do you want to explain what Build Change does?
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you all. So we were actually founded by Dr. Elizabeth Hausler, and she was a bricklayer. So she went out with her dad every summer and her sister, and they laid bricks because her dad built houses. And then she went on to get a PhD in engineering and founded Build Change. So we focus on doing structural retrofits for families so that we can make their houses safer so they don't crumble when there's a disaster. So we started off responding to areas that were especially prone to earthquakes and making sure that the masonry buildings didn't collapse by installing a ring beam, by making sure that there was structural integrity of the home, so reinforcing the doorways and the windows. But since that time, seeing the frequency and the intensity of climate events, we've been focused more on the prevention side and making sure that as the climate continues to change, we have ways to protect families from that as well. So what that can look like is in an area that floods frequently, shoring up the first story of the home so that then it can accept the load and the weight of adding a second story on top. And this serves a couple of purposes. One, it expands the home so they can have other family members move in or maybe start a business from one of the floors. And then if there are frequent flooding events like we're seeing in areas like Honduras, the family can actually have their valuable belongings upstairs and a generator up there and be able to move their family members into a safe place as the floodwaters rise. And so we're very concerned about the change in climate. We're seeing more people being displaced because of climate. And so as engineers, you can play a really critical role in helping us save families and protect people and also their livelihoods.
The Christian Climate Observers program, which is the program that I went with, was also just really incredible to be a part of because it was just great being with like-minded people who share the same faith as me, but also share this passion for climate justice and climate action because of their love for God and his people and his creation. All in all, the conference really confirmed for me the career path that I want to take, and it really educated me on so many things that I thought I knew about climate change but really didn't. There's still so much to learn about climate change and what's happening on a global scale. I'm really, really grateful to have had the experience to go to COP27. I hope it's not my last COP. I hope that my work in the future takes me there again, but it was a great experience, and I really hope that I've been able to share some of the things I've learned with anyone who's watching this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you have any questions, as usual, please reach out, and we will see you in the next video.